Raven's Son by Nicholas Cottar, Book 1. Book 1 is called The Song of the Siren. The song of the siren can overthrow kingdoms. I know, I have seen it. I have seen the song make gods of men. The song carved the eternal city of Vasilia out of the mountains. The song transformed queens into healers, so that thousands were made well with a single word. But ever it comes as a harbinger of affliction. Only in the fire of adversity does the pure water of healing flow. From the Journals of Cassian, Dar of Vasilia. Chapter 1, The Song. The song teased Voron at the first hint of sunrise. His sister, Labia, still slept, and he rose quietly, trying not to wake her. Outside his window, the trees were encased in overnight ice. Branches, like freshly minted blades, clanged against each other in an almost military salute. As Voron leaned against the sill, the sun breached the summit lines and the ice-encased branches glowed from within. The song rose in a vast crescendo, then faded again. It stopped its breath short, like a punch to the chest. "Amil," said Labia, from across the room, her hair rumpled from sleep. "Amil, little bird." He whispered, hoping she would turn over and fall asleep again. It cut him deeply that she still could not sleep on her own, despite her 16 years. The sun's morning sparkle through hoarfrost, she said, laboring through a yawn. One of her eyes remained stubbornly closed. "That's how the old tales call it. Amil. The blessings of Adonius, you know?" Voron smiled, though there was little to smile about in the purple shadows under her eyes. She needed to sleep if she were ever to find her joy again. "What is that?" She indicated the parchment lying on the sill, garnish in its profusion of purple and red. "One of the Dar's huntsmen claims to have seen the white stag." Personally, Voron doubted it. Her second eye opened. "The white stag? Dar Antomir wishes to hunt the deer of legend?" "He's anxious to begin as soon as possible," said Voron. Too anxious, he thought, but kept it to himself. His advisors are less sure. The Dars called together a small council this morning. Privately, Voron wondered at the Dars' eagerness. Yes, catching the white stag was supposed to bring prosperity to the hunter's city for 7 generations, but although legends grew in Vasilia with the same profusion as lilac trees, they mostly stayed bound to the page. "Why does he want the approval of his advisors? Couldn't he just announce the hunt and be done with it?" she asked, rubbing her right eye with the heel of her palm. It's complicated." Only last week, the Dar's head drooped in sleep during a small council. Dar Antomir is of a different time. Most of his advisors are young, and they would prefer to leave old tales and superstitions behind. In fact, I think there are some who wouldn't mind so much if Dar Antomir retired from public life and allowed Mirnian to take a more active role in Vasilia. "I see, meddling nags." Voron laughed. "I agree with that sentiment wholeheartedly. He would much rather wander the wilds than sit in council with the representatives of the 3 reaches of Vasilia. Do you have to be there? Why not stay home for once?" She looked away as soon as she said it. His conscience pricked him. Labia was practically begging him, and he knew how much she hated to beg. It had been far too long since he stayed with Labia at home, helped in the kitchens, took a long walk with the family. in the family vineyards or actually read something with her, but Dar Antamir depended on him, even more than he depended on his son, Mirnian. I wish I could. Oh well. She put on a feeble smile like a mask. Never mind. Only please don't stay at court the whole day. You can't imagine how oppressive this house can be. Yes, I can, he thought. Why do you think I avoided it so much? Nothing like an empty house to remind you of your parents' absence. I expect I'll be back before evening, he said, and his conscience pricked him again. He doubted he'd return before night. Sleep now, my spawnling. You need to rest. She looked at him without blinking for what seemed an inhumanly long time. Voran, do you think maybe if I had done something differently... Lebia, don't. He hurried to her and sat by her on the bed. You were the least problematic child in Vasilia. Mama's disappearance wasn't your fault. I remember there were times when Papa looked at me with those heavy eyes, like he was trying to remember what it was like to love me, to love Mama. Couldn't he have really... Lebia, don't believe the gossip. The bruises on Mama's arms were part of the disease. She nodded thoughtfully. I don't know why she left when she did, Swanling, but the fact that he went to find her proves that he loved her, don't you think? Her look only mirrored his own thoughts. He didn't love us enough to stay. Please, Lebia, you need to sleep. She hugged him and turned over. Within a minute, her breathing had deepened into sleep. May all the powers damn him for leaving you, Lebia. The curse did not give him the pleasure he hoped. It gave him no sudden illumination about the nature of Aglia's disease. It suggested nothing new about Octigen's madness and subsequent disappearance after implication in the mass murder of other Vasilii. Nothing but questions, as always. At this early hour, he went out the back door of the wine cellar. Sherry of waking the servants. He managed to close the door with no noise, but the gate at the end of the overgrown back garden moaned like a thing diseased. It always did, but Voran always forgot. Cursing inwardly, Voran looked back at the house. No one seemed to stir within. The house's 2 stories lurched over him, the shadows thrown back by the morning sun threatening him, as though the house itself were angry that Voran was master instead of his father Octigen, as though it were Voran's fault that his mother had fallen prey to a strange illness, then disappeared inexplicably. The song appeared again, hardly more substantial than the red alpenglow on the underside of the clouds. Voran's heart swelled as he turned away. Octigen's house was nestled among the other estates of the third reach of Vasilia. Voran loved to walk the flagstoned road, though the reach as it crisscrossed the cherry groves of the noble families. Amid the trees, the mansions, each a fancy in carved gables, lintels, and columns, stared at each other as though they, like their masters, were jealous of each other's status. Some of the most extravagant even sported gilded cockerels on the roof. Voran was grateful that it was generally considered in bad taste. Every house was built on a small mound, better to overlook the other 2 reaches that extended downward and outward along the slope of the mountain, like the skirts of the great dress. Voran knew that, if looked at from below, the houses sparkled like jewels every morning, a reminder to the lower reaches that such opulence was as far out of their reach as the heights themselves. Voran stopped at the crossroads, where stairs carved into the mountain led down to the second reach. Just to the left was Dar's place, its 7 onion-domed towers carved out of marble blocks, each larger than a single man. He hesitated, unwilling to brave the nag of the small council yet. The second reach spread out beneath him in clean lines of austere homes set apart by stone hedges, staircases, and canals, all in keeping with the military calling of most of the inhabitants. "Make way," said a voice behind him. Before Voren could turn around, a mail-shod shoulder pushed him off the path. Voren landed knee first in the mud. "Well, well, it's the son of Otogen," sniggered Rogdai, the chief warden of the gates of Vasilia. "You seem to have lost your warrior's edge. No graduate of the seminary should ever allow himself to be surprised by an enemy in the open. I'll have to speak to the elders about it. Maybe they can find you a post in Dar's library." The two subwardens flanking him laughed, but their knuckles were white on their pommels. Ever the paragon of civility, Vohin Rogdai, said Voren, forcing his tone to remain calm. He would have preferred to knock the idiot's teeth into the back of his head. "Thank you for pointing out the weakness of my defense. I will gladly accept your further instruction in the sword ring, where I'll poke more holes into you than a sieve." "A pleasure. It's been years since my sword has tasted traitor's blood. Shall we say this evening? I've always thought sword fights are best done in torchlight." "Where fewer people can see how bad you are," Voren thought, "or how you cheat." "I'm afraid today I'll be too busy hunting and catching the white stag." "You?" Rogdai spit. "You'll catch the beast as soon as the sun sets in the middle of the day." "I smell a wager," said Voren. "My father's entire wine collection if I don't bring it back by midnight." Rogdai's face twisted in indecision. The superstitious idiot was afraid of drinking the wine of a suspected traitor. On the other hand, it was the best wine in Vasilia. "Done," growled Rogdai. "I wager a public feast hoisted in the central square by my family in your honor." "No, in my father's honor." Voren smiled at the way Rogdai twitched. Voren was sure he would just walk away. The coward. "Done." Rogdai's teeth sounded ready to break from the strain of his jaw. "Not 1 minute past midnight, mind." Voren inclined his head. Rogdai and his flunkies walked by, their shoulders not quite as straight as before. The wind picked up and whipped Voren's hair into his face. Annoyed, he pulled it back. As he did, the song rose, as though it were carried by the wind. He gasped for a moment. It was so intense, and it seemed to whisper a thought to him. "Go now, forget the small council. Go find the stag, now. Leave the blind to lead the blind." Voren was running even before he realized it, but not toward the palace. He angled away from it, toward the headwall of Vasilia Mountain. Voren avoided the streets, sprinting along dirt paths behind the gardens of the third reach. Here the trees were wider, native fir and spruce for the most part, sometimes avoiding the path outright. Voren veered toward the largest of many canals that watered the three reaches, all of them fed by Vasilia's twin waterfalls. As he reached the canal, all signs of domestication faded, replaced by mossy rocks and tree roots. Even the air smelled differently here. The spicy smell of the nobles' kitchens gave way to the cool scent of the pine. Though he knew the way well enough, it took him a moment to find the ivy-encrusted archway that led to the staircase going up away from the city. Dar and Tamir would forgive him, Voren was sure, especially if he found the stag. An honor for his family, a boon to his disgraced name. 7 generations of prosperity to his city, if the legends were to be believed, of course. Did he believe them? Voron wasn't sure anymore. The wind gusted, dousing him with the spume of Vasilia's twin waterfalls, thundering on either side of the ancient stairway. With it came the music, louder than ever. He closed his eyes, savoring. Only when he clung to the face of the mountain was the melody this vivid. It sounded as if the mountains, the trees, the clouds all sang, and only for him. He reached a ledge and pulled himself up. He was soaked from the exertion of the exertion and the mist. Falling on one knee, he raised both arms towards the rising sun. Adonias, accept the prayer of this scion of the dishonored house of voyevoda Ottegen. May my hunt not prove futile. The song hung on the air like a memory, then faded. He leaned back against one of the stone chalices that collected the water from the falls, each taller than Vasilia's famed birches. The chalice hummed with the steady rhythm of the waterfall pounding it. At Voron's feet, a stone mouth, faintly reminiscent of a dragon's head, spit the gathered water down the city's canals. How mad and beautiful, he thought, considering the dragon. In the old times, things were made with beauty in mind, not merely usefulness. How unlike these times. With the passing of the song, Voron felt emptied, hungry for recurrence of the song. It did not return. Voron stretched his shoulders, relief flooding into the popping joints. He sat at the ledge's lip, resting his feet on the dragon's ears. Miles upon miles of the woods beyond the city lay carpeted at his feet. It was the perfect vantage point. As he stared into the spaces between the trees, Libia's shadowed eyes kept intruding on his thoughts. He really should spend more time with her, not conjure up excuses to remain at the warrior seminary after hours training the boys. Her plea pained him. He had not realized that she was so lonely at home. But of course she was. She had few friends, tainted as she was with their father's assumed guilt, their mother's inexplicable disappearance. He promised himself he would take her to the forest more often, maybe even let her spend the night under the stars with him, as he loved so to do. He was wrapped up with the image of her smiling at the innumerable falling stars on a late summer night that he nearly missed it. Something gold flashed in the woods far beneath him. Voron's heart stopped, then raced forward. A white streak passed through the trees. Fearful of moving even a muscle lest the vision fade, Voron continued to stare. It moved again, now clearly visible. A white stag. It took Voron a maddening hour to get through the city's reaches and out the gates, another half-hour away from the paths as he tried to get his bearings in the forests beyond the city. He was intent on his path, like a pointer on the scent. But when the howling started, his blood turned to ice in his veins. He had heard wolves before. This was no mere wolf. The sound was deeper and darker, like the buzz of a hornet compared to a fly. He tried to recall the details of the many stories of the white stag. Was there a legendary predator to accompany the legendary quarry? Not that he could remember. A blur of white raced before his eyes, so close he could spit at it. In an instant it was gone. The sun showered the foliage with dappled light. Something that was not the sun, a strange golden mist light, flickered through the trunks, as though the stag had left a trail of light behind it. The mist beckoned him deeper into the forest. Voron plunged headlong into the deep wood. The strange light continued before him for a mile or so, then blinked out. Voron looked around and realized he had never been in this place before. He stood on the edge of a clearing, awash in morning sun, so bright compared to the gloom of the woods that he could see nothing in it but white light. He stepped forward. The light overwhelmed him, forcing him to crouch over and shield his eyes. Fuzzy at first, then resolving as Voron's eyes grew accustomed to the light, the white stag towered in the middle of the clearing, almost man-high at his shoulder. Its antlers gleamed gold, so bright that they competed with the sun. Voron froze in place and adopted the deep, silent breathing pattern that an old woodsman taught him as a child. Inch by inch he reached for his bow. His quiver hung at his side in the Caroline manner, so taking the arrow would be the work of half a second. But extracting the bow strapped to his back was another matter. A single bead of sweat dropped from his forehead and slid down the side of his nose, tickling him. The deer turned its head to Voron, showing no inclination to flee, as though Voron were nothing more than a fly. It flicked both ears and continued to graze. The howl repeated, just to Voron's right. Out of the trees crept a black wolf, the size of a bear, its fur glistening in the light of its antlers. It paid no heed to Voron, leading with bristling head toward the grazing deer. It lunged, blurring in Voron's vision like a war spear, but the stag leaped over it and merely moved farther off to continue grazing. The wolf howled again and lunged again. Back and forth they danced, but the stag knew the steps of this death dance better than the wolf. His nonchalance seemed to infuriate the hunter. The wolf charged so fast that Voron missed its attack. The deer flew higher than Voron thought possible, and its golden antlers slammed the wolf's flank like a barbed mace. The wolf screamed. The sound ripped through Voron, an almost physical pain. The stag trotted to the other end of the clearing. Looking back once more, it waited. Goose-fleshed tickled Voron's neck. The stag called to him, teasing him to continue the hunt. Voron ran, and the deer launched off its back legs and flew into the waiting embrace of the trees. Voron stopped. His body strained forward, intent on the hunt, but his heart pulled back. The wolf. He could not leave a suffering creature to die, even if it was the size of a bear, even if it would probably try to kill him if he approached. With a groan for his lost quarry, Voron turned back. The wolf dragged itself forward with its forepaws. Each black claw was the size of a dagger. As Voron approached, its ears went flat against its head, and it growled deep in its throat. Voron's hands shook. Gritting his teeth, he balled his hands into fists and willed himself to look the wolf in the eye. Its ears went up like an inquisitive dog's. It whined. In the eyes of the wolf, Voron saw recognition. This was a reasoning creature, not a wild animal. "I can help you," he found himself saying to the wolf, "as to a human being, if you let me." The wolf stared at him, then nodded twice. Voron pulled a homemade salve, one of Labia's own making, from a pouch on his quiver. Tearing a strip from his linen shirt, he soaked it with the oils and cleaned the wound of tiny fragments of bone. The wolf tensed in pain, then exhaled and relaxed. Its eyes drooped as the pungent odor suffused the air, mingling with pine scent. Soon the wolf was snoring. As Voron watched the sleeping wolf, something stirred in his chest, a sense of familiarity and comfort he had only felt on rainy evenings by the hearth. For a brief moment, the wolf was a brother, closer even than any human. Perhaps it was better that he had given up the chance to hunt the stag. This stillness was enough. A rustle of leaves distracted Voron. He turned around to see the white stag returning into the clearing with head bowed. Voron could not believe his good fortune. He would be the successful hunter. His family dishonored name would be raised up again on
Vasilia's lips. Trembling again, he reached for his bow. The stag stopped for a moment as if considering. More boldly he walked to Voron. Voron's heart raced at how easy this kill would be, but the excitement died when the stag didn't stop. He stared right at Voron as he strode toward him. Voron pulled out an arrow and nocked it. The stag walked closer. No, he couldn't do it. The beast was too noble, his eyes too knowing. Killing him would be like killing a man in cold blood. The stag stopped close enough that Voron could touch him. To Voron's shock, he bowed his 2 forelegs and dipped his antlered crown into the earth, a king of beasts making obeisance to a youth of a mere 24 summers. Gathering courage, Voron approached the stag. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the antlers. Something shook the branches in the trees ahead. Voron looked up, shoulders tensed. Some sort of huge bird, much bigger than a mountain eagle, perched in the crown of an orange-leaved aspen. No, not a bird, something else. Then Voron understood, and terror and excitement fought inside him, leaving him open-mouthed and rooted to the ground. The creature had a woman's face and torso seemingly blended with the wings and eagle body. Her head was adorned in golden brown curls, and each feather shone like a living gem. A siren. She opened her mouth and sang. It was his song, but he had never heard it like this. Voron no longer felt his body. It soared above the clouds. It plumbed the depths of the sea. It hovered on the wings of a kestrel. The song pinioned him like a spear to the earth, but raised him on a spring breeze above the world's confusion. He was once again in the arms of his mother as she nursed him, her breath a soft tickle. He was inside the sun, and its music weaved him into existence. The earth shuddered, and he knew that he could turn it inside out. The song of the siren stopped, and life lost all meaning. It was all gray, ugly, useless without her song. When he came back to himself, the stag, the wolf, the siren were all gone, though her song lingered on the air. It seemed he would never rest, never sleep, until he found her again. The prince, beguiled by the aspen grove, sat down to sleep, a sleep that lasted 327 years. From The Sleeping Wood, Old Tales, Book 1. Chapter 2. The Pilgrim. It was a few hours after midday, on the same day, as far as Voron could tell, in the enormous dark of leaves. He walked in a direction he hoped would lead him back down to known paths, but he still recognized few of the trees or hills. The undergrowth was so thick that Voron suspected he had stumbled on a true wildwood. He didn't know there were any left in Vasilia, for though there were few outlying villages outside the city proper, many Vasilii had been woodsmen in their time, and hardly an inch of copse, plain, or grove was undiscovered. One thought niggled the back of his mind, where he tried in vain to keep it contained. It whispered that he was no longer in Vasilia at all, that he had entered a different realm from the human, though he had just encountered not one but 3 legendary creatures. Voron was not yet ready to believe all the old tales to be true. He stumbled out of the murk of oaks into the breathing space of an alder grove. He was exhausted. Laying down by his bow, quiver, and sword, he sat at the base of a young tree and leaned back. He should be more worried about losing his way. His provisions were few. He had drunk all his water before midday, and poor Libya would be frantic with worry. But he found he cared little for any of that. He was not even anxious to find Vasilia. Nothing mattered so much as finding the siren, as hearing her song again. A kind of echo of the music thrummed through him stronger than his own heartbeat. Whenever he stopped moving, everything around him moved with the rhythm of the siren's song. The wind tossed the branches in her cadence, the birds chirped in unison. His own heart and breath began to move with it, until he thought he would go mad with its insistence. It was not the music itself, he realized. It was the incompleteness of it. The siren had sung, but not to him. To the trees and the beasts, perhaps to the summits and rivers, but not to his heart. The thought held a creeping dread. If her incomplete song had caused him to go half mad, what would happen if she directed her song at him? Nevertheless, to contemplate the possibility of not hearing the song again terrified him, like a childhood dream of a parent's death. As for finding her, none of the old tales were particularly helpful. The siren were capricious, appearing in their own good time, in their own chosen place. You did not seek out the siren, they sought out you. But he had no intention of waiting patiently for the song to return. He needed to do something. The stag. Somehow, the white stag and the siren were connected. He couldn't exactly understand how, but it made sense on a level of intuition. The stag was of a different world, the world of the tales, the world that never encroached on everyday life, at least until today. If he found the stag again, perhaps it would lead him to the siren. His heart accelerated. Why had he not considered it before? The Dar would have already gathered the hunting party to search for the stag. All of Vasilia, rich third reacher and poor first reacher alike, would be lounging in pavilions and on wool blankets before the city, feasting and awaiting the return of the hunters. Perhaps they had caught the trail already. He must stop them at all costs. He tried to jump up, but found that his limbs were not responding to the commands of his mind. His eyelids were heavy, his head drooped, hungry for sleep. What had overcome him? He had hardly been out for half a day. And then the realization speared him. He was stuck in a sleeping wood. By the heights, surely that old story wasn't true as well. Out of the corner of his vision, a hairy creature waddled toward him. He couldn't move his head to see it clearly. He heard a porcupine snuffle, though it was far too large to be a tree pig. It stood up on two hind legs, growling in the process. All matted hair and dirt and encrusted leaves, it growled. Something changed in the music of the grove. At first, Voron couldn't place it, and then he realized it was the birds. They no longer sang in rhythm to the siren song, but to another music, more somber and ancient. Every branch in his vision hopped with purple, red, golden, brown songbirds. There was even a firebird trilling on one of the larger branches. The hairy creature snuffled back into the oaks. "You shouldn't amble through these woods, young man. The lows of are not to be lightly encountered. All manner of strange things are possible here." Warren strained to move his jaw and realized that nothing held him in place anymore. He jumped up so suddenly that the speaker, too, took 2 alarmed steps back and raised a walking stick in warning. "I'm sorry, master," said Warren, eagerly to make amends. "I didn't mean to startle you." "No harm done, young man." The voice was as harsh as rock grating on rock, though it had an uncanny melody. It oddly harmonized with the bird-song. "Tell me, what brings you to the lows?" The man's face was wrapped in some coarsey gray fabric, though a beard poked out of it here and there. He was a huge man, outgaining Voron by at least a head, and Voron was of the warrior caste. Something about him suggested incredible age, but he moved confidently like a young man. Voron urgently wanted to make friends with this strange man. "I am lost. My name is Voron, son of Otigen of Vasilia." The man's gray eyes flashed like the sun reflecting off the snow. "The son of Otigen? You are far from home, young man. How long have you traveled, then?" Something in the pit of Voron's stomach twisted. "Only this day I was hunting the white stag." Voron expected the man to laugh, but instead he unwrapped his face, revealing a smile of recognition. Like the beard, the man's entire face resembled carved stone. "Ah, fellow seeker, what good fortune! I am a pilgrim, young Voron." Voron could not believe his luck. Pilgrims were unnamed wanderers who traveled all lands searching for the beautiful and the terrible. They were whispered to have a special grace of Adonais. Meeting a pilgrim in the wild was more valued than catching a questing beast. Hoisting a pilgrim brought one's family years of prosperity. Many a well-bred housewife would brave open war with her neighbors for the sake of a pilgrim's visit. "Good fortune indeed, master. Where do your feet take you this day?" Voron hoped he remembered the correct traditional addresses to the pilgrim from his seminary days. "My feet go where they will, young Voron." The pilgrim bowed his head, acknowledging the formality gracefully. Voron's shoulders relaxed. "But meeting you perhaps has indicated a surer path. You wish to return to Vasilia? It will take a week at least, if you take the usual paths." Voron's mouth must have dropped open in shock, because the pilgrim laughed, if harsh rock can be imagined to laugh, and tapped his chin with his stick. "You meddled with the powers, young man. No telling what sort of trouble you've gotten yourself into." "Pilgrim, what do you know of the siren?" The pilgrim stiffened in suspicion. "Why do you ask? Have you not been chastened enough for your curiosity?" "Forgive me, it's just, I have seen a siren. I have heard her song." The pilgrim's eyebrows rose a fraction and his eyes widened a jot, but his body remained still. Voron imagined it took great effort to appear so little moved. "White stag," the pilgrim murmured, more to himself than Voron. "Siren song. Is it that time already?" He seemed to make up his mind about something, and now his gaze was firm. "Come, Voron, I will take you to Vasilia a different way." Everywhere the pilgrim went, hollow ways seemed to carve themselves through the trees. Where Voron saw nothing but trees, the pilgrim picked out alleys between birches, passages between beeches, and doors through sagebrush. It was like the land belonged to him. As though seeing with new eyes, Voron was inundated with details of the forest he had never before bothered to notice, and he wanted to stop to breathe in the warm birch smell, to pick out the male sparrow's call from the female's, to run his fingers through the rain-soaked juniper for the joy of the sticky drops. But he had to run to keep up with the long strides of the pilgrim. "Pilgrim, what was that thing in the sleeping wood? How did you scare it off?" The pilgrim stopped walking, turned to Voron. "That? Oh, nothing but a harbinger." He smiled at something. "Things stir in the deep woods. Things you, Vasily, have not seen, or even ever heard of, for a very long time." He continued forward with even more determined tread. "Voron, tell me something. While traveling, I have heard tales about your father. Are any of them true?" The anger rose in Voron with a suddenness of nausea. "Which tales, pilgrim?" he asked, unable to hide the quiver of anger in his voice. "That he massacred innocent people, or that he beat my mother, forcing her to run away from Vasilia in half-mad state?" The pilgrim stopped abashed. "Surely that is not what is said of Aglia." Voron stopped in mid-stride. The pilgrim had knowledge of his mother. The possibility made his heart run in circles in his chest. "Pilgrim, do you know what happened to my mother?" The pilgrim smiled, but did not answer the question. "Boron, am I wrong to believe that you have never spoken of these things to anyone? Will you consider it brazen of a pilgrim to ask your confidence?" Boron's mouth began speaking even before he gave it permission. "There is no one I can confess to, Pilgrim. Labia, my little sister, is still haunted by nightmares. She was only 8 years old when we both lost our parents. The Dar is eternally sympathetic, but I don't feel comfortable burdening him with personal worries. His daughter, Sabinia, my intended—" The heat rose in Voron's cheeks. "Well, she is very protective of Labia, and has a flinty nature. I find it better not to speak of it in her presence." The pilgrim smiled knowingly. He pointed forward with his staff, offering Voron to continue speaking while they walked. Voron nodded, and they both walked forward as the carpet of fallen leaves rustled comfortably underfoot. "Pilgrim, have you heard of the time of ordeal?" "Oh, who has not?" "Vasilia's warrior seminary is famed for it, though I believe my knowledge of it to be several 100 years out of date." He laughed with a faraway look, as if remembering. Surely he was not that old. "Tell me, how many houses are still existent of the original 7? "3 remain. All 3 are segregated, as you know, coming together only for the training and vigils of the ordeals. The gates of the seminary close, and no one is allowed in or out, not even with the messages from family members. The Dar himself has no right to open the gates, except of times of war. The vigils, physical training, and period of intense contemplation are every bit as grueling as the tales have it. 8 years ago, I volunteered for the ordeal of silence 4 years before my allotted time. It's a vow that few take, and hardly ever in their 16th year, but I sought out the opportunity with pleasure. Voron, did you know that some of the oldest legends claim that the successful ordeal of silence, fulfilled before its time, is rewarded with a siren song?" It explained a great deal. "No, Pilgrim, I did not." The pilgrim's smile was knowing. Chills ran down his spine. It was strangely pleasant. "A week into the ordeal, my mother fell ill. None of the physicians understood it. There were lesions and bruises, and she just withered away. Then she disappeared. No note, no sign of departure, nothing. She just vanished. When I successfully finished the ordeal, the Otogen I found was half the man he used to be. He had recently returned from a week of searching the wilds, but had found no sign of her. His state grew steadily worse until I was forced to beg release from my studies, something I hated to do. Soon after, Father volunteered for a commission to Karela. There were unfounded rumors of nomads uprising in far Karela, and it had led to a worsening of tensions between the Vasilia and Karela. He joined the garrison, guarding a group of ambassadors who hoped to strengthen Karela's ties to the throne of Vasilia. I was against Father's going from the start, but the Dar insisted, said it would do him good. Though the haze of memory, Voron saw that he and the pilgrim walked along a more recognizable path than before, and the aspens interspersed with pines hinted that they were coming nearer to home. "You never saw him again?" said the pilgrim. Voron nodded. He didn't have the heart to speak of the murder of the ambassadors to Karela, or of his father's assumed guilt in their murders. "Voron, I thank you for your confidence. You may not understand yet why a pilgrim would be so interested in your family history. I hope when the trials begin that you will find some solace in our shared confidence." Before Voron could answer, he was distracted by a white streak to his left. The stag! The path turned sharply and led them to a bald patch in the wooded hills, where they entered open sunlight for the first time since leaving the sleeping wood. The white stag walked toward them in a straight line. He stopped a foot in front of them, and Voran saw that there was a shimmer in the air between them. Voran touched it, and his hand could not pass through. A transparent wall? "Never mind, old friend," the pilgrim said to the stag. "We have need of you after all." The deer raised his head and shook it. Snorting, he pawed at the ground with a foreleg. The pilgrim smiled at Voran. "He's annoyed with you. He would much rather remain Vasilia. Good country, he says, even if a bit on the forgetful side." Voran was dumbfounded. "Vasilia is on the other side of that transparent wall?" The stag bowed as he had in the clearing, and the gold light from his antlers burst out. Voran raised an arm to his face, but the stag was already gone. The mustiness of Vasilia's birches inundated Voran's senses. He and the pilgrim stood next to a saddle-shaped branch that Voran often slept on during the hot afternoons. "The white stag is a bearer," the pilgrim explained, "a sort of doorway between the worlds, you know. But to bear us to Vasilia, he had to return to the lows of air." Voran felt no more enlightened than before, but the pilgrim only rumbled heartily laughter and strode uphill toward Vasilia. All of Vasilia feasted before the gates. Close to the walls, rows of wedge pavilions marked the families closest to the Dar's regard, all from the third reach. Farther downslope, canvas tents flapped on sturdy frames. First and second reacher families gathered around the makeshift hearths. Heavy pots boiled over with stew. Carts pushed by pantalooned merchants wended their way among the feasters, regardless of social standing. In the midst of it all, a small replica of the market-day stage had been built, and a storyteller had all the children in stitches, while their parents feigned seriousness, though most couldn't hide their abashed smiles at the ribaldry their children didn't catch. On any other day, the spectacle would have cheered Voran. He loved a good pageant, as did any Vasilii. To see the entire city together like this, the reaches mingling, was a rare thing, and yet something was lacking. Somehow, everything about Vasilia now seemed half empty, devoid of meaning. The master bell roared in the palace belfry, announcing the return of the unsuccessful hunting party. Copper bells followed, a syncopated chorus beating in rhythms to the bay of the hunting dogs. Silver bells clamored in the rhythm of the 1,000 blackbirds. "Pilgrim," he said, straining to hear himself over the ding of the bells, will you do my house the honor of staying with us while you visit Vasilia?" "Of course, Voran. I thank you for the offer." His voice was more resonant than the bells. For a quick moment, Voran thought that the grey cloak and the stony visage were a kind of mask that the pilgrim chose to assume for his own purposes, and that his real face was different. But the moment of intuition faded. Voran shook his head, befuddled. The mountain city loomed before them, many-tiered and many-terraced. Its houses and streets hugged a sloping peak that curved upward like a saber to a pinnacle high above the mists. Amid the pines and spruces, the city of Vasilia seemed to have grown from the mountain's bones as many years ago. Towers were extensions of crags. Alleys, bridges, and archways were natural hollows and caves gently bent to human will. Something deep within the city compelled Voran. Not the Vasilia built of wood, cobbled with stone, and planted in earth. No, that was little more than a mask, like the mask of the pilgrim. The real city lay beneath it. For the first time in his life, Voran sensed there was something living, something vital in the heart of Vasilia, something no one knew about or even suspected. The hidden Vasilia whispered to him, though he could not parse out the words. "You surprise me, young Voron," said the pilgrim. "How quickly you pierce to the heart of things. Whatever happens, my falcon, do not forget this. Vasilia is everything. You must never let Vasilia fall. She is everything."
Vasilia is the mother of cities. Nebesta, our first daughter, will forever be jealous of her second place. Karila, the runt of the 3 city-states, will seek every opportunity to thrust thorns into the side of her mother. But I charge you, my sons, remember this: a true mother always slaves for her children. From the Testament of Cassian, Dar of Vasilia. Chapter 3. The Market. To Voron's annoyance, the pilgrim plunged into the middle of the assembled throng of Vasilii. Voron had hoped that he could have the pilgrim to himself for a time, before the tide of adoration inevitably took him, but Voron's worries were unfounded. The pilgrim walked among the people of all reaches, speaking to none and being addressed by none. It was almost as if the people could not quite see him, and yet everywhere he went faces brightened and conversation turned boisterous. Even the colors of fabrics seemed brighter after he had passed. Walking unnoticed among the people, Voron and the pilgrim reached the gates of Vasilia. As they did, Voron's heart skipped a beat. He had forgotten that they would have to pass through the first reach. "Pilgrim, shall we go up another way?" He pointed at one of the smaller gates at a higher elevation. It avoided the first reach entirely. The pilgrim looked at Voron, and it seemed that he looked through him. Voron was ashamed of himself and of Vasilia, ashamed that this splendorous city still had the poor of the first reach in dim alleyways where dogs and children lay side by side in filth. "Lead us as you will, Voron," said the pilgrim. His eyes seemed to chide Voron, and he felt his face burning. Voron's heart gently inclined away from his desire. To his own surprise, he found himself leading the pilgrim into the first reach, not away from it. The gates of Vasilia yawned to accept them. They passed under the arch, 2 massive beech trees carved out of marble, leaning toward each other, locked in an embrace of branches and leaves. The refined perfection of the carving seemed worse than a mockery compared to the squalor of the first reach. Voron's senses were overcome, as though he were experiencing the first reach truly anew. Smells of horse dung and freshly baked bread mixed together. The chatter of playing children and the barking of old mongrels joined in a strange cacophony. Most of the houses were hardly more than sticks leaning against each other with a board for a door. They were not built along any ordered streets like the second reach. Instead, they seemed to be thrown about randomly. Foul-smelling dirt roads meandered between the houses in towering dung heaps, some of which smoldered with fire that never went out. And yet, behind all that, Voron sensed something he never felt in the third reach. Some native vitality bellied the filth and poverty. Yes, the suffering around him was obvious. Every street corner was littered with beggars. Some of them fought for territory out in the open, pummeling each other with no cares for the glances of others. A few children had the glint in their eyes as they assessed the contents of his pockets. But most of the people here seemed more real than the other reaches. There was something natural and unconstrained in their interactions with each other. It contrasted sharply to the careful conventionality of the merchants, the sour disdain of the nobles, and the constipated piety of some of the priests. Voron approached the opulence of the third reach with conflicted emotions. From his newfound perspective, he saw his father's house as a sprawling monstrosity inundated by peach and cherry trees like weeds. Among them, Libya danced, arms outspread. The setting sun lit up 3 singing firebirds on her shoulder and arms. Libya? She turned, startled, and the birds flew up at once, giving her a red-gold halo. She smiled, and her smile's warmth was even more astonishing than the firebirds. Libya ran to him and embraced him, her golden curls pouring all over his shoulders. He picked her up and twirled her as she loved. She laughed, as though she had not a care in the world. Years of tension sloughed off his shoulders like old skin. "I'm sorry I took so long, Swanling." "Oh, Warren," she said, ignoring his words completely. "I've been trying for months to get the firebirds to come down to me, and today they all came at once, singing. Can you imagine?" Warren was astounded. What had happened to his sad Libya? "Libya, dear, run and tell cook to prepare something to eat quickly. We are honored with a pilgrim's stay tonight." Libya was suitably impressed as she assessed the pilgrim towering behind them in the shadows of the cherries. "You grace our house, pilgrim," she said formally, with a touch of uncertainty. "The honor is mine, little swan," he said with disarming tenderness. "May the blessings of the heights be forever yours." Libya smiled a little, stealing a quick glance at Voron, and said, "I am not quite sure what to make of him." Voron inclined his head toward the house. She bowed to the pilgrim in the formal Basilian manner before running into the house, hair streaming behind her like a banner catching the wind. Voron sat the pilgrim at the place of honor in Otigen's own high-backed oak chair, then bowed to one knee before him, a supplicant in the traditional ceremony of welcome. "Pilgrim, I greet you for Basilia. I greet you in the name of my father Otigen. May his honor be restored. I greet you on behalf of my sister and myself, the Dar and his family. I beg you to bestow upon us Adonaius's grace, given to all who choose to wander the wilds in search of the beautiful and the terrible." The pilgrim looked briefly uncomfortable at the mention of Adonaius, but he laid 2 hands on Voron's head and said, "Sometimes the heights are moved by our fervent supplication. Sometimes they are silent for our hidden good. I wish that Voron will find the strength to choose the right way among all ways, though it may be the most painful." A wave of heaviness lifted from Voron's shoulders. He felt younger than he had in years, worn down as he had been by his family situation. His head was clear and bright, as after a full night's sleep. Still, a shadow lurked behind the final words of the pilgrim's blessing. Voron and Libya served the pilgrim with their own hands, while the servant girls stood in the doorway gawking at the sight. The pilgrim hardly ate anything, though he constantly thanked them for the morsels he did eat. He enjoyed the drink in greater quantities. Only after he put his horn down for the final time did Voron and Libya sit down on either side to begin their own meal. As they ate, the pilgrim grew more and more somber. By the time Voron and Libya had finished, he stared at Voron intently with a pained expression. It unnerved Voron, making the space between his shoulder blades itch wildly. He wanted to pelt the pilgrim with his questions as soon as possible, but convention would not allow it. At table, a pilgrim spoke first. "Voron, tell me about Basilia's great tree." Voron's ears perked up at his tone. There was no doubt the pilgrim was testing him. Something told him that much would depend on his answer. He tried to feign calmness. "Well, it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? It's hardly even a tree. It's an aspen sapling. But, well, it's on fire. Every year the priests officiate a ceremony that summons fire from the heights. It keeps the tree's fire fresh and the sapling eternally young. The pilgrim looked annoyed. No, tell me what it is. Something stirred in Voron's memory, an old story his nanny used to tell him. It used to be called the Covenant Tree. The details escaped him, no matter how hard he tried. A seal of Adonaius's promise to Vasilia. What promise? Whispered the pilgrim, his tone urgent. A promise of protection. Yes, a girdle of protection against, heights. I don't remember. The pilgrim sagged into his chair, a look of open despair on his face. The stag was right. How forgetful Vasilia is. I had not realized how forgetful. Voron slept badly and lay awake before the sun rose. The morning fog promised to dissipate, though the clouds in his mind threatened to remain the whole day. Something must be done about it. Not bothering to dress, Voron slipped on his boots and wrapped his bare chest with his old travel cloak. Labia didn't stir, even when he climbed out the window and slid down the carved lintel to the gardens below, to the brook that Otajan, with the Dar's blessing, had redirected from one of the city's canals, their own private river. At least I can thank you for this one good thing, Father, Voron thought, throwing off his boots and cloak. He flung himself into the water, bracing for the icy shock. It was immediate and glorious, the sun inside his head bursting apart his huddled thoughts. As he rose again into the cold, he laughed with pure exhilaration. Afterwards, he sat at the river wrapped in his cloak, which did little to stave off the late autumn chill. The momentary euphoria of the swim had faded, leaving behind nagging unease. The song of the siren, which would often tease him after his morning wash, had stopped entirely since his encounter with the stag. Early riser, Voron? The pilgrim materialized out of nowhere, making Voron's heart attempt a desperate leap out of his chest. Voron laughed, shaking with more than the cold. Good morning, pilgrim. He gestured for the pilgrim to sit. I could not sleep. Too many questions. Have you considered that you may not understand the answers yet, even if I told you everything? In any case, I am eager this morning to take part in the feasting before the walls. Will you come with me? Inwardly, Voron groaned, but he nodded. It would be my honor. Though it was very early, already many people were huddled around their makeshift hearths in the fields, busy with breakfast. There was a joyful tenseness in the air. Vasilia had not yet tired of waiting for the success of the hunt. Already the bustling marketplace stood ramshackle around the storytelling stage. The married women in headscarves with temple rings, the young women with their hair unbound or in the telltale single braid, they all regarded Voron and the pilgrim with smiles that rarely lit their eyes. The men in tall beaver hats and wide sweeping coat sleeves barely looked at them before passing on to the more important business of the day. Pipers and fiddlers danced and spun about among the people, sometimes narrowly missing colliding with them to general comic effect. Again, that nagging sense that something was missing bothered Voron. It was as though Vasilia were a woman far past her prime who still painted her face in the fashion of a newly married youth. The pilgrims showed little interest in the usual wares, ceramics, fabrics, trinkets fashioned from wood, some of which sang on their own, some of which moved around in choreographed figures. The chalices of gold did not hold his attention. The woven tapestries may as well have been rags. He walked past the most ornate stalls with hardly a glance, though many of the merchants' wives, impressed with his mien, tried their loudest to attract his attention. Like hens flapping their wings to attract a cockerel, Warren thought. The only stall that seemed to interest the pilgrim was that of an old potter. It was hardly a stall at all, rather a tattered canvas hung around a frame of grey wood. It stood at the farthest edge of the market, surrounded by refuse. The potter, who smelled as bad as his teeth looked, could not even speak from surprise when the pilgrim approached him. All of his wares were plain, unglazed, though Warren sensed that they were made with great skill. The pilgrim seemed to think so as well. He pointed at the urn of perfect proportion, smooth and undecorated. A hand-written rag sported the price, 2 copper bits. Warren winced at the price. This potter must have no business at all if he is willing to sell his handiwork for so little. May I buy this? The potter stuttered something unrecognizable. I'm sorry, my brother, said the pilgrim. I did not hear you. The potter's eyes changed. Their dull yellow cleared to white, and something in them sparkled. To Warren's surprise, the potter seemed to shed his years before their eyes. He wasn't old at all. He was hardly more than 40. From a traveler, I ask nothing but blessing, he said. Take it with my thanks. Warren was taken aback. The man spoke in a beautiful accent, similar to how the old priests spoke. It was a pleasure merely to listen. May you be blessed, my brother, said the pilgrim. The potter continued to watch after them as they walked back to the center of the market. Shame nagged at Warren, though he couldn't exactly explain why. The pilgrim returned to the center of the market, where the tallest hats and the shiniest temple rings congregated. Approaching a ceramics merchant, he pointed to an urn twice the size of the potter's, glazed and hand-painted with fanciful images of animals and plants interweaving so tightly it made the head spin. Ah, you have quite the eye, good sir, simpered the merchant, his 5 jowls quivering with subservience. Best Nebisti make, that is. The pilgrim raised the decorated urn to his right, the potter's simple clay in his left. The crowd stilled. Just before it happened, Warren saw in his mind's eye, and he had to stop himself from laughing. Sudar, said the merchant, using the honorific of respect for a person of intermediate social class. May I ask what you intend? All the ladies gasped in unison as the pilgrim dropped both urns to the ground. The Nebesti urn shattered with a beautiful noise. Next to it, the potter's vessel lay as though no one had even touched it. And so falls Nebesta, whispered the pilgrim, his eyes bored into Voron. But will Vasilia prove to be as strong as the potter's urn before the coming darkness? Voron's stomach churned at the pilgrim's words, but the pilgrim merely turned and walked out of the market, accompanied by shocked silence. Voron picked up the potter's urn and turned to pay the merchant. Will a silver suffice for your trouble? Voron asked, abashed. The merchant glared at him. 5 silver ovals, not a lead jot less. Voron chuckled at the merchant's willingness to take advantage of the situation, but he still pulled out only 2 silvers. He handed them for a moment, looking over at their rough edges. These coins were little more than silvers cut from a long bar of grey metal, How strange that they were more cherished in Basilia than the life-earned work of an artisan like the poor potter. Shaking his head at the own muddled thoughts, Voron dropped the silvers down on the bulbous palm of the merchant. He rewarded Voron with cursing eyes. The pilgrim was already halfway back to the city, his shoulders bent and his step labored. Voron had no trouble gaining on him this time. "Sudar!" called a voice behind them. It was the potter. "Please," he said, running up to them. "I know you must be a pilgrim. Forgive me, but would you honor my house?" He seemed to run out of words, though his hands continued to gesture expressively until he noticed and laughed at himself. Voron had never seen such unguarded simplicity in any man. Everyone he knew seemed to plan every gesture, every word spoken in public. This spontaneity was strangely refreshing. "Yes, we will come with pleasure," said the pilgrim.